You may not be able to see the end of that text. This is my body given for you. It's from Luke's Gospel, from the account of the Last Supper. Another of the well-known things about the shroud is that it's possible to analyze it and produce a three-dimensional accurate image of the form of Jesus. Now, the way this is done is that the shroud can be analyzed for areas of light and shade. Any area in the original which is darkest is represented by a peak on this computer image, and any area which is light is represented by a trough. So, for instance, the parts of the body which were actually in contact with the cloth, such as the forehead, the nose, the beard, the hands, they form the darkest image. And so when we analyze the shroud in this way, the darkest areas produce this raised image. A more modern attempt to do this is here, where we can see a bit more detail, particularly of the hands. Now, when they look at what parts of the body actually cause an image, obviously the parts that were in direct contact made the darkest, but also, this is a mysterious aspect of the shroud, even parts of the body that weren't in contact with the cloth still formed an image, although fainter than the direct contact areas. Any part of the body which was up to 4 centimeters away from the cloth caused image formation, but if the cloth was further away than that, it didn't. And the cloth records how close it was to the body it was covering so accurately that when we do this analysis of the light and shade, the realistic form of Jesus stands out. Another way to think about how this works, you know those pin art frames that you get kids for Christmas? You put it over your face and it creates a realistic impression of your face. To state the obvious, the way it works is, of course, the bottom end of the pins is in direct contact with the body, and so the body literally pushes the image out of the frame. The shroud essentially works in the same way, but instead of using pins, it uses variations of shade. So the parts which are most closely pushed against the shroud create the darkest image areas, which when analysed then produce that three-dimensional shape. Now, what is the significance of this? The first thing I think it says most straightforwardly is to remind us of the real bodily truth of the incarnation. Christianity is not one of those religions where someone goes into a cave and comes out with a book and says, God dictated this to me, and that's all it's based on. The incarnation is the astonishing truth that God so loved the world that he wanted to become part of it. And as we see from the record of injuries on the shroud, which by the way go far beyond any of the gospel descriptions, which really skate over the detail of the passion compared to what we see in the shroud, we see that it was God's intention not just to enter into his creation, but to suffer alongside it. And as a statement of solidarity with suffering mankind, the shroud is an astonishing image. But I think it goes beyond that. If you look at the shroud image as it appears to the naked eye, all you see is this just flat two-dimensional image, which is not very convincing. It's clearly, it appears to be just a representation of Jesus. We're meant to think of him when we see it. But then we do know, as we've already seen, that when you reverse the areas of light and shade, when you go through this sort of metanoia process looking at the shroud, all of that living realistic detail is contained in it. Now, the appearance then is very different to the reality. It reminds me of that poem which everyone studies in schools when they have to do the war poets, Rupert Brooke, who in his poem The Soldier is the one that goes, if I should die, think only this of me, the corner of some foreign field will be forever England. And then the line goes on to say, there shall be in that rich earth a richer dust concealed. That the shroud always puts me in mind of that. We look at this very plain two-dimensional blurred image, but we know that deep within it, if we can only see it through the right eyes, all of this detail is there. But I think to a Catholic, something rather more significant should come to mind. When we look at the Eucharist, we look at this, what appears to be just a plain wafer of bread, we might be able to understand that it's symbolic of something or a metaphor for something, but we struggle to see any more than that, because when we receive it, when we taste it, it just looks, tastes and feels exactly as it appears to be. But we believe that something more substantial has happened in transubstantiation. The substance, the reality of what we're dealing with has changed despite appearances. And now, when you look back at the shroud, it's, I think, a very similar thing. You look at the original and it's not a terribly inspiring image compared to the reality. But not only does the appearance conceal the reality when we see it through the right eyes, but if you think back to the way that the cloth has in its fibers the three-dimensional form of Christ encoded into it, it's as if the body of Christ, in a strange way, is still in the shroud. Scientists can analyze it and produce the three-dimensional form of Jesus. It's an astonishing idea. The body was not only wrapped in the shroud, but its presence affected the cloth and changed the substance of the cloth. Remember, I said that the whatever kind of power or radiation was released by the body in producing the image hasn't just caused an image, it's changed the biochemical structure of the fibers themselves, and in such a way that the three-dimensional form of Christ is still retained in the cloth if you see it through the right eyes. To me, it's an incredible sign pointing us towards the importance of the Eucharist, which again is one of those things which could have been easily forgotten or lost by the original church. If you read in John chapter 6, I think, when Jesus is saying, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you can have no part, excuse me, no part of me. And many people were horrified by this teaching and abandoned him, leaving only the disciples in a small group. So it's one of Christ's teachings which is the most difficult to receive. So again, I think the shroud, the nature of the image is that it's clearly reminding people of the reality behind the Eucharist, that surface appearances can hide a genuine transubstantiation, a change in the substance of the thing itself. This idea behind the shroud only occurred to me in the last week or so. I've been sitting with the shroud for 20 years trying to see the image again for the first time, because you get too bogged down in forensic detail and carbon dating. I've been trying to say, what actually is the shroud? What is it genuinely trying to tell us? And if you pull back and just look at the shroud again with fresh eyes, in one way, the shroud is simply saying, this is my body. And this is my blood. It's the very heart of the Mass. It's been described as the source and summit of the Christian life, is this recognition that in the Eucharist, Christ is really present. So